The light flickers. A lifeless body lies twisted on the floor. In the basement, a young girl is tied to a cold water pipe. A plastic bag covers her head. Across the room, a middle-aged man, eerily calm, is setting a camera on a tripod. Click, the shutter snaps. Another work of art is complete in his mind. You've just stepped into the mind of BTK, a man who didn't just kill, but savored his crimes like art. Now let's go back to where it all began. 1974, Wichita, Kansas. Part 1, Into the Darkness. The 15th of January, 1974, Wichita, Kansas. It was a clear Tuesday morning when police officers stepped into a single-story home on North Edgemore Street. The door had been forced open by a relative who could not reach the family inside. What they found beyond that threshold would mark one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Kansas history. 4 bodies, 3 rooms. A silence so thick it felt like time had stopped. The father, Joseph Otero, lay lifeless in the master bedroom. His hands and ankles were bound. A cord wrapped around his neck, tied in a complicated series of loops. Beside him, his wife, Julie, showed similar signs of ligature strangulation. But it was the children who brought a different weight to the room. Their daughter, Josephine, just 11 years old, had been hanged in the basement. She had been partially undressed and tied to a sewer pipe. The youngest boy, Joseph Jr., lay near the hallway, suffocated, a plastic bag tied over his face. His wrists bore the bruises of resistance. The killer had cut the telephone line. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive, no witnesses, and no fingerprints. The only clue was the method. The bindings were handmade. The knots were practiced, almost ritualistic. Investigators noted a strange calm in how the bodies were arranged. There was control, not chaos. At first, detectives from the Wichita Police Department believed it might have been a home invasion gone wrong. A robbery, perhaps. But nothing had been stolen. No cash was missing. Jewelry sat untouched. The family dog had not barked. Whatever happened inside that house had occurred with precision. Later that day, crime scene technicians examined the basement. On the wall above the girl's body, a faint shoe print could be seen in dust. The autopsy confirmed what the scene already suggested. Josephine Otero had been kept alive after the others were killed. She was the last to die. The entire department was shaken. Many had seen homicides. Few had seen anything like this. The killer had lingered. He had waited. He had chosen each moment deliberately. The case was immediately classified as a high priority, multiple homicide, and detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. No one reported hearing anything unusual. One neighbor recalled seeing a man walking down the alley behind the house around 8:30 a.m., but could not describe him. The sighting yielded no results. Without a suspect or motive, the case stalled quickly. Back at headquarters, the lead investigators began to study the bindings again, the pattern of knots, the choice of cords, the careful placement of each loop. It was not random. This was not someone acting out of desperation or rage. This was someone following a plan. Within days, the media began covering the story. But the real fear started to grow not from what was reported, but from what was left unsaid. This was no ordinary killer. There had been no signs of struggle. No defensive wounds on the parents. No forced entry. The killer had taken his time. He had known when the family would be home. Whoever he was, he wanted control. And then, less than 3 months later, he would strike again. But this time, someone would survive. The second crime would reveal a pattern. But it wasn't just violence repeating, it was something deeper, something more calculated. What the killer left behind would start to draw a silhouette, faint but unmistakable, of a man hiding in plain sight. Part 2, the rise of BTK. By April 1974, 3 months after the Otero homicides, Wichita law enforcement was still without a suspect. The case had unsettled even the most experienced detectives. Then, a second crime occurred. It was different in detail, but disturbingly familiar in tone. On the 4th of April, Catherine Bright, a 1-year-old college student, returned to her home on South 13th Street with her brother, Kevin. As they entered, a man stepped out from behind a door, brandishing a handgun. He claimed he was a fugitive in need of money and a car. At first, he seemed calm, but within minutes, the situation escalated. Kevin was bound and taken to another room. While attempting to free himself, he was shot twice. Bleeding heavily, he escaped through the front door and collapsed outside. His sister did not survive. Catherine was stabbed multiple times. The pattern of violence suggested something more than panic or improvisation. Her bindings were improvised, but her wounds were deliberate. The attacker had brought materials with him. He had waited. The level of force used, especially against a young woman with no apparent connection to him, pointed to something compulsive. Forensic details began to paint a behavioral outline. This offender operated with patience. He used deception to gain entry, then controlled the environment. The use of ligatures, the element of overkill, the lack of material theft all suggested a signature rather than a motive. This was not a man reacting, he was performing. Still, without a clear connection between the Bright and Otero cases, detectives could only speculate. It would take another 3 years before the killer chose to reveal himself. In October 1977, a 4-year-old woman named Shirley Vienne was found murdered in her home. Her 3 young children had been locked in a bathroom. She had been tied to a bed frame and strangled with a rope. A plastic bag had been used to cover her head. Once again, there were no signs of forced entry or robbery. The killer had gained access through manipulation. 9 weeks later, Nancy Fox, a 5-year-old secretary, was found strangled in her home. This time, the police received a phone call at the dispatch center. The caller calmly described the address and confessed to the murder. Investigators traced the call to a nearby payphone. Surveillance footage was unavailable, but the voice on the recording was clear. Male, steady, and completely emotionless. Shortly after the Fox case, a typed letter was sent to a local television station. The writer claimed responsibility for all the murders. He named Otero, Bright, Vienne, and Fox. He described details that had never been released to the public, including the bindings, the positioning of the victims, and the use of plastic bags. The letter was signed with 3 initials, BTK. The acronym was explained in the body of the letter: bind them, torture them, kill them. The killer was giving himself a name. It was not a message of guilt or remorse. It was a statement of identity. Behavioral analysts within the department recognized the emergence of a compulsive pattern. The killer was not only escalating in violence, but evolving in method. Each crime showed an increased level of psychological control. He had developed a pattern of contacting authorities after the killings, sometimes days later, indicating a need for recognition. The BTK letter was carefully typed, with no fingerprints or saliva on the envelope. It was mailed from within the Wichita area. Investigators believed the killer might be watching media coverage closely. In response, law enforcement withheld portions of each crime from the press, hoping to filter future correspondence. From a psychological perspective, the killer's need to control extended beyond the physical crimes. He inserted himself into the investigation. He guided public perception by deciding what to reveal and when. This created a dynamic in which BTK was not only the predator, but also the narrator. No forensic evidence at the time linked the scenes conclusively. DNA testing was not yet in practical use. The killer left behind no usable prints, no usable fibers, and no witnesses who could describe him in any useful detail. Still, patterns began to emerge. Victims were often alone in their homes. Most were women. Entry was gained through manipulation, not force. The killer used pre-tied ligatures or made use of household items. The strangulation method varied, but was always deliberate. The psychological profile forming around BTK described a man likely living a double life. Organized, educated, possibly employed in a technical field. capable of delayed gratification, comfortable with planning. The community responded with visible fear. Sales of locks, alarms, and guard dogs spiked across Wichita. Women began attending self-defense classes. Parents changed routines. But the killer's behavior suggested he was watching all of it. Then, in 1979, an elderly woman named Anna Williams narrowly avoided becoming the next victim. She returned home late one evening to find her house had been broken into. Jewelry was missing. Drawers were rifled through. Police discovered ligatures placed in advance and windows left slightly open. A few weeks later, a package arrived at a local news station. Inside was a poem, a scarf, and a drawing that resembled Williams bound and dead. The killer had been there. He had waited. She had simply arrived too late. This event marked a shift. For the next 6 years, no additional murders were connected to BTK. Whether he stopped or adapted remained unclear. Behavioral analysts suggested he may have entered a dormant phase, a psychological hibernation, often observed in offenders with compulsive cycles. What remained consistent was the imprint he left behind. A killer who wrote letters, named his own persona, and treated violence as performance. He saw himself not just as a criminal, but as an author of fear. The investigation remained open. Files expanded. Analysts revised the profile again and again. What made this killer so difficult to catch was not just the lack of evidence, but the precision with which he constructed his narrative. He chose the scenes, the timing, and the message. He was telling a story, and for the moment, he controlled every chapter. As new technologies emerged in the 1982nd, the case would quietly shift behind the scenes. Patterns were digitized, physical evidence was preserved. The letters were re-examined with emerging linguistic tools, yet the killer remained silent. The name BTK continued to echo, not as a solved case, but as a psychological puzzle. The man behind the letters was still out there, somewhere in Wichita, perhaps living among the very people who feared him. He watched his legend grow while staying just out of reach. This stage of the case presents a unique behavioral phenomenon, a killer who carefully curates his own legacy while withholding his identity. For investigators and analysts, understanding what drives that balance between public declaration and private silence became the next critical focus. Part 3, Behind the Mask. By 2004, the case file marked BTK had grown into a labyrinth of statements, sketches, and unsolved clues. The killer had not been heard from in years. Investigators assumed he had either died, moved, or simply stopped. Then, without warning, a new letter arrived. It was addressed to a local television station in Wichita. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to a woman murdered years earlier. Attached was a puzzle, a list of chapter titles, and a return to the name the city had not spoken in over a decade. BTK. The forensics team responded immediately. The envelope showed minimal trace evidence, but the killer had made one critical misstep. In a follow-up exchange, he sent a floppy disk, asking whether police could trace it. Detectives assured him through a classified ad that it was safe. He believed them. The disk, once analyzed, contained hidden metadata. It showed that the file had been last edited by someone named Dennis. The document had been saved at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Cross-referencing that with church staff led detectives to a man named Dennis Lynn Rader. He was not unknown in the community. At the time, Dennis Rader was 60 years old. He was married, had 2 grown children, and had served as president of the church council. His neighbors described him as quiet but involved. He worked as a compliance officer for Park City, issuing code violations and monitoring local ordinances. He was seen as firm, sometimes overly strict, but never suspicious. He owned a Jeep Cherokee, similar to the one described by a witness decades earlier. His home was modest. His family, by all accounts, had no knowledge of any criminal behavior. But behind closed doors, a different life had taken shape. Surveillance was initiated. Officers monitored Rader's movements. They watched his church. They traced his routines. Still, probable cause was required. Without direct physical evidence, an arrest could not be made. Investigators turned to an unconventional method. Dennis Rader's daughter, Carrie, had once submitted a DNA sample for a medical procedure while attending Kansas State University. That sample was retrieved through legal channels and compared to DNA extracted from under the fingernails of a past victim. The result showed a familial match. It did not identify Rader directly, but confirmed he was the biological father of the donor. This was the breakthrough investigators needed. On the 25th of February, 2005, Dennis Rader was taken into custody near his home. During transport, he asked a single question whether the officers had spoken to anyone else. That question, seemingly harmless, revealed his awareness of the implications. He understood what had happened. The search of his property uncovered binders filled with detailed records of the murders. Each contained sketches, photographs, maps, and typed descriptions of the crimes. Some were labeled with code names. Others included fantasy narratives. These were not spontaneous acts. Each had been documented, rehearsed, and preserved. Inside a small metal shed on his property, officers found masks, women's clothing, and Polaroid photographs. In some images, Rader posed in self-made bondage scenarios. He wore garments taken from victims, recreating the scenes in private. He used timers and tripods to capture himself in submission. These artifacts revealed the psychological core of his compulsion. Dennis Rader maintained two identities. In public, he was a husband, father, church leader, and local official. In private, he was methodical, obsessive, and driven by violent fantasy. His crimes were not committed out of opportunity or anger. They were calculated performances designed to fulfill a narrative he had written for himself. Behavioral analysts later described Rader as exhibiting traits of narcissistic personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and elements of sadistic paraphilia. He sought control, not only over his victims, but over the institutions around him. His letters to the media, his manipulation of police communication, and his detailed logs all pointed to a need for validation. One investigator noted that Rader did not kill to hide. He killed to be seen. But he wanted to control how he was seen. When public interest declined, he reinitiated contact. When media coverage increased, he withdrew. He dictated the terms of his own notoriety. Psychologically, his ability to compartmentalize was critical. He could issue citations to neighbors for overgrown lawns during the day and return home to document a fantasy involving rope and staging. He passed multiple psychological evaluations during his career. No coworkers reported any inappropriate behavior. His family remained unaware. They had never seen the masks. They had never noticed the storage shed being used. His wife filed for an emergency divorce following his arrest. His daughter later stated she could never reconcile the father she knew with the man responsible for the murders. The duality of Dennis Rader's existence poses a profound challenge to behavioral profiling. His case is often cited in forensic psychology as an example of latent pathology masked by extreme social normalcy. He did not fit the stereotype of a serial killer. He was employed, married, active in his community. Yet beneath the structure of his routine, a private mythology had developed and been nurtured for decades. The materials he kept were not trophies. They were symbols of authorship. Each image, drawing, and letter was part of a project, a self-made legacy crafted over 30 years. As his arrest unfolded, analysts began revisiting old assumptions. They reconsidered definitions of criminal deviance. They reviewed how social presentation can conceal pathological intent. The BTK case demonstrated that monstrous behavior can coexist with civic order, and that the face shown to the world may only be a fraction of the truth. Understanding that dissonance became essential not only to solving this case, but to preventing the next. For investigators and scholars alike, Dennis Rader's dual identity remains a case study in concealment, planning, and psychological architecture constructed not out of impulse, but from sustained intention. Part 4. Fall from grace. In early 2005, Wichita detectives received a small package. It arrived at a local news station and was forwarded to police. Inside was a purple floppy disk, along with a few printed photographs and a cryptic letter signed by a familiar moniker, BTK. Before this moment, investigators had only circumstantial behavioral analysis and unsolved evidence. This disk would provide the first traceable link in over 3 decades. The killer had asked in a previous communication whether a floppy disk could be traced back to its sender. Authorities, through a public newspaper ad, falsely assured him it could not. He believed them. Once examined by forensic analysts, the disk yielded a file with hidden metadata. It listed a document last modified by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. That discovery narrowed the search immediately. A staff roster revealed a council president named Dennis Lynn Rader. Further investigation confirmed that Rader lived in Park City. He matched the psychological profile compiled over the years. He drove a black Jeep Cherokee. His address was within the vicinity of past crimes. But most importantly, he had a daughter. And that daughter had previously submitted a DNA sample to Kansas State University's medical program. A court order allowed investigators to obtain that sample. It was not a direct match to DNA from a preserved crime scene, but showed strong paternal alignment. Statistically, the probability of such a match being coincidental was negligible. With this development, authorities had enough to act. Dennis Rader was arrested on the 25th of February, 2005, as he left his workplace. During the initial interrogation, he remained composed. He asked if his family was safe. He inquired about the media. His demeanor was measured. There was no sign of panic. In the hours that followed, Rader began to speak. What unfolded was not merely a confession, but a chronological catalog of events. He described each crime in methodical detail. He gave names, locations, times, and methods. He referred to them as projects. Each had a code name. He identified pre-offense routines, surveillance techniques, escape strategies, and post-crime rituals. What stood out in the interviews was not the content, but the tone. Rader spoke without emotion. His narrative was clinical. He corrected minor inaccuracies. He mentioned how long he had watched each victim before acting. He explained his staging process. He recalled exact knots he had used to bind them. According to his testimony, the crimes were never impulsive. He planned for weeks. He rehearsed actions mentally. He selected victims based on vulnerability, opportunity, and isolation. He often waited inside their homes for extended periods before they arrived. He described the control as essential. In his own words, the killings were not about hatred. They were about power. He described a psychological force he called Factor X. He claimed it was uncontrollable. Experts later reviewed that claim with skepticism, suggesting it was more a rationalization than a true diagnosis. The subsequent search of his home confirmed the confession. Boxes of documents, photographs, and clothing were found. Some had been stored for decades. He had kept items belonging to victims in labeled envelopes. He had taken photos of himself reenacting scenes while wearing their clothes. These were not trophies, they were records. The narrative he created within those files mirrored a kind of authorship. Rader saw himself not only as an actor, but as a documentarian. The boundaries between reality and his inner narrative had eroded. The binders were organized chronologically. Many pages contained corrections, diagrams, and alternate outcomes he had considered but not executed. During pre-trial proceedings, psychologists evaluated Rader. The diagnosis included narcissistic personality traits, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and elements of paraphilic disorder. However, they agreed that he was legally sane and fully aware of the criminal nature of his acts. In June 2005, Dennis Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He waived his right to trial and described the murders in open court. Family members of the victims listened in silence as he recounted the deaths. His statements were calm, even instructional. At one point, he corrected the prosecution's timeline by referencing his own records. During sentencing, Rader gave a prepared apology. He addressed the families. His language was formal, almost rehearsed. Legal analysts and mental health professionals commented on the disconnect between his tone and the magnitude of his actions. The court viewed his behavior as confirmation of his calculated emotional detachment. He received 10 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He was placed in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility. His cell remains isolated from the general population. Visits are limited, mail is screened, his name is barred from any personal gain derived from public use. The collapse of Rader's double life was not sudden. It was the result of cumulative oversight and a single moment of technological arrogance. His belief in control extended even to the system designed to capture him. That overconfidence became his undoing. For criminal psychology, the BTK case remains significant, not just for its brutality, but for its clarity. It demonstrates how a structured life can hide profound pathology. It challenges assumptions about what evil looks like, and it reveals how language, documentation, and identity can become mechanisms of both concealment and exposure. Understanding Rader's need for narrative control offers insight into broader patterns of organized serial offenders. The drive to document, to name, to communicate with investigators is not always a compulsion. Sometimes it is a strategy, a way to manage legacy and to remain relevant, even in silence. Part 5, Echoes in Silence. On the 18th of August, 2005, Dennis Lynn Rader stood before the Sedgwick County District Court in Kansas. He faced sentencing for 10 counts of first-degree murder. Each charge had been meticulously documented through his own confession and supported by physical evidence recovered from his home. The court proceedings were structured, methodical, and unusually devoid of objection or appeal. Rader had already pled guilty. The trial served only as confirmation of what had been thoroughly established. During his formal statement, Rader spoke for nearly 30 minutes. He apologized to the families of the victims and acknowledged responsibility for his actions. His language remained formal and emotionally restrained. Observers noted that his tone lacked genuine remorse. His body language did not reflect internal conflict or distress. The consistency between his demeanor during interviews and his court appearance suggested emotional dissociation rather than temporary shock. Each family was given the opportunity to speak. Victim impact statements varied in tone, but all conveyed enduring psychological trauma. Several described the years of uncertainty and the reactivation of pain upon learning that the offender had lived among them. The courtroom remained quiet throughout. Rader did not respond to their statements. He maintained visual contact with the judge and prosecutors, but avoided direct interaction with the victims' families. Judge Gregory Waller delivered the sentence. Rader received 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The formal ruling noted the degree of planning, the psychological manipulation involved, and the targeting of vulnerable individuals. The sentence structure ensured that Rader would remain in prison for the rest of his life without eligibility for early release or sentence reduction. He was transferred to El Dorado Correctional Facility and placed in administrative segregation to mitigate risk from other inmates. The conclusion of the legal process shifted public focus from prosecution to understanding. In the aftermath of the sentencing, academic institutions and criminal psychology programs began extensive case analysis. Rader's behavior introduced new reference points in profiling structured offenders. His dual life, marked by extreme compartmentalization, contradicted several long-standing assumptions about visible deviance. Analysts re-examined the role of social conformity in masking pathological behavior. The materials recovered from Rader's home were preserved for behavioral research. Analysts confirmed that the content revealed not only premeditation, but post-crime reinforcement. His documentation ritual served a regulatory function. By recording his actions, Rader sustained internal gratification independent of public attention. His correspondence with law enforcement and media functioned as an external feedback loop. It allowed him to validate his constructed identity as BTK without breaching his civilian facade. This behavior indicates deliberate concealment, not disorganized compulsion. The temporal gaps between murders reflected a capacity for delayed gratification and strategic withdrawal. The return of communication in 2004 was not triggered by opportunity, but by unmet psychological needs. The decreasing media attention activated a compensatory response. The floppy disk, which ultimately led to his capture, was an extension of his attempt to reassert narrative control. Forensic psychologists concluded that his offenses were rooted in power-oriented paraphilia rather than reactive violence. The killings followed specific staging procedures and involved elements of symbolic reinforcement. The integration of fantasy and reality in his private recordings pointed to a sustained cognitive distortion that supported ongoing justification of his actions. The Wichita community responded to the case with long-term adjustments in public safety awareness. School curricula included expanded units on threat recognition and emergency response. Law enforcement adopted more comprehensive protocols for tracking behavioral patterns across unrelated incidents. The case reshaped investigative emphasis from physical evidence alone to include linguistic profiling and media interaction patterns. In broader criminological study, Dennis Rader's case remains a benchmark in understanding high-functioning offenders. His ability to maintain stable employment, community status, and family life while engaging in serial violence challenges existing models of early detection. The case also underscores the role of self-authored identity in criminal persistence. BTK was not a label assigned by the public. It was a name created, managed, and promoted by the offender himself. The narrative arc of the BTK case does not rely on ambiguity. It is defined by the clarity of its resolution and the precision of its pathology. Rader's actions were not acts of impulse, but results of prolonged internal construction. His story continues to inform clinical, academic, and investigative frameworks. The name BTK no longer serves as a mystery or symbol. It is a completed case study, documented, analyzed, and understood within its full behavioral context. What remains is not speculation, but reflection. The legacy of Dennis Rader exists in silence, in data, and in the continued evolution of methods designed to prevent his kind from emerging again. If control was the engine behind every decision he made, what does it mean when that control is permanently removed? What remains of the persona when no one is left to fear it?